So when you look at the weapon systems, the locations, the vehicles, the types of boats and weaponry that show up all over Great War of Separation 1 and 2 and in the Horseman, but most specifically, you look at the uniforms, the Great War of Separation could not have possibly occurred before the year. What started out as a simple question very quickly turned into an examination of the impeccable research skills and consistent storytelling of Chuck Dixon. So much so that I believe I know when the Great War of Separation happened. So let's look into it. If you haven't read Horseman Part 1, Great War of Separation Part 1, or Great War of Separation Part 2, now is a good time to leave. There are going to be a lot of spoilers. When I was sitting in a call in the Rippaverse Discord, some fans were talking about clues as to when the events of Rippaverse were happening, and they asked if I could take a look at the Great War of Separation series and see if any equipment or weapon systems jumped right out at me and could maybe refine the timeline. And so I did. And I found a lot of clues. Right away, I saw a few things that I hoped were going to be more helpful than they were. Like the presence of the B-2 bomber, the presence of the A-10 Warthog, and the presence of multicolor thermal FLIR cameras on helicopters. Unfortunately, all of those technologies are much older than you would think. But as I read more and more, I started seeing things that did speak to specific points in time. One of the very first things to jump out at me was the presence of an extremely large mining truck that the Mexican side of the war uses to crash into a border control point. When I looked at the truck, I noticed a few things. One, its size. That's made it very distinguishable from any other mining truck, but it said cat on it, as in Caterpillar. So I started looking into that. The very first thing to pop up was the 797 series, but the problem is there's actually quite a few 797 series trucks, and they're all a little different, but and this is a credit to, again, the research of Chuck Dixon and the accuracy of the art of Jack Herbert, because there is a detail. When I looked at the ladder, I was able to cancel out a large number of large mining trucks made by Cat. But as I looked at the features of the truck, I noticed something. The panels on the front are flat. They're not angled at any point. And the headlights are small squares, not large circles. Of all the 797 series trucks, that's only true of one, the original 797 truck. So that was already creating anchors and timelines. So I had to look up when that truck went out. Unfortunately, it was in 1990. That's not super helpful, but at least I know nothing in this is occurring before 1990. The next large thing I noticed is when I saw a scene where the President of the United States in the Great War of Separation, so not in control of Texas, is flying on Air Force One. And since Jack Herbert drew the panel as a ultra-wide shot, it shows the tail number. The tail ID was 28000. So I went to check if that's a real tail ID. And it is. That tail ID belongs to a very specific plane, the Boeing VC-25, Air Force One, brought into service on September 6, 1990. As the war goes on, I start noticing little things. Almost everybody's using an M4. Almost nobody uses the M16. You can tell by comparing the M4's collapsible buttstock and shorter barrel to the M16's static buttstock and longer barrel. That happened during GWOT. So again, we're in post GWOT times and the weapons are almost universal. So it wasn't a freshly rolled out weapon, it was damn near everybody had one. The M4 was not new. Another thing that told me that this is post GWOT, or at the worst during GWOT, was the way that the Humvees are up armored. They're not standard armor. That was armor kits made for IEDs. If you look at the gunner's hatch, you see up armored plates around where the gunner would sit and where the weapon system actually faces windows. That happened in GWOT, and it lets the gunner look through windows while staying down behind the armor. So from there I decided I needed to branch out my research a bit, and I had to start looking at other books that might provide clues. One thing I do know is when Hector arrives in Flores Park, it is after the Great War of Separation, because he sees Brian Solari in his Alpha Corps suit, not in his Brian Solari in the Exceptional suit, and he sees the Eagle Nest in flight, which means this is happening well after the Great War of Separation. And keep that in mind for later. In the Horseman Part 1, Hector sits and talks to a therapist. He talks about his flashbacks to when he was in the military, and a few things are put in stone. The team that Hector operated in was a hunter-killer team from the 75th Ranger Regiment. That is stated in the books, and it can also be put together in clues from Horseman Welcome to Flores Park, but most importantly stated in the books. He was fighting in Missoula, and as I watched the scenes as he describes the firefights that he was in and how Deacon dies, I noticed something. The ambulance. And that is not any ambulance. That is a 6x6 MRAP Cougar variant ambulance, which means after a little bit of research, I found, according to military.com, that particular vehicle got fielded in 2004. So we've moved the timeline up from 1990 to 2004. Unfortunately, I can't really say exactly what year that he was deployed to Missoula, but I did notice that they're wearing DCUs. And even though that doesn't tell us a year, it is going to tell us something later. Another thing that I noticed was that the vehicles were equipped with the LVOSS system, which is effectively just smoke launchers, designed to be able to throw smoke all around to obfuscate the vehicles. Unfortunately, that technology, again, is older than people think, and couldn't really pin the timeline any better than I already had it. Stepping away from military technology and just looking at other technology actually made a big jump in the timeline. Anyone who has ever worked with the federal government knows that the federal government loves Cisco phones. They are everywhere. Every government office you will ever go to the DMV, you are going to see Cisco phones. The government loves Cisco phones. And I started noticing in different scenes in the Great War of Separation, I was seeing phones, and they were definitely Cisco phones, judging by the shape of them, but I also have to leave some wiggle room for art styles and for the fact that I can't see the front of the phone, just the back. Based on the shape and where the receiver sits on the model of the phone, I was able to figure out that it's either the 7800 model or the 8800 model. And either way, that's good news because they were both released in 2013 according to Cisco. So now, as we're looking at the Great War of Separation starting to unfurl, we know that even though those may be old phones, we know we are no farther back than 2012, 2013, depending exactly which model they are. Unfortunately, I can't say because I can't see the front of the phone. But that brings the timeline up to 2012, 2013. Another thing I noticed is that in the scene where Zeno is approaching Mexican forces, or at least I assume they're Mexican forces because they're all speaking Spanish, they're sitting next to a Cougar. Not the same 6x6 variant that we talked about before. This is the 4x4 variant, but it's still an MRAP system, which means it was created during GWOT. It was a mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicle. So the idea of the Mexican side of the war having those tells me this is well after the MRAP Cougar was pretty much everywhere. They weren't specialized vehicle, they were the standard, which means, again, this cannot be before GWOT. But then something big happened. In Great War of Separation Part 2, the United States Navy starts seizing oil rigs off of the shores of Corpus Christi and Galveston, and Jack Herbert drew the shot of the boat out by the oil rig, and that's no ordinary boat. That is a U.S. Navy patrol boat Mark V, and according to military.com, the Mark V patrol boat was first fielded in 2015, and I thought, that's it. 2015 is the war, the Great War of Separation happened because that boat didn't exist. And I was just looking through a couple really cool fun facts that weren't necessarily time anchors, but I just thought were really, really fun to know. Isam's dad, in the scene where US forces are attacking the Texas Capitol, he goes to aid Governor Plessy. Governor Plessy, on the spot, promotes him from Sergeant First Class to Second Lieutenant, a battlefield promotion. And that shows him in his dress uniform just a few panels later. Now, something I noticed that this is probably one of my favorite fun facts about Rippaverse, but on his lapel, there's a symbol. The symbol is a castle. Only one corps in the Army wears a castle. That is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer. So that means he was an engineer. And even though he's an officer now, which would make him a 12 Alpha, he was enlisted before, so he couldn't have been a 12 Alpha. Now, considering how fast he jumped into action, started kicking doors and running around with a weapon, I'm gonna guess he was a 12 Bravo. And if he's a 12 Bravo, that means he's going to be very knowledgeable on the use of explosives for breaching, destruction, construction, and all manner of things that combat engineers do. That's what a 12 Bravo is. So, in the Great War of Separation Part 3, you might just see Silman start using explosives, and if you do, it'll make sense. That doesn't tell us anything. The fact that he's an engineer is just something that makes me personally very excited, but the uniform does. See, that dress uniform he's wearing isn't a Class A uniform. The generation of dress uniforms for the Army just before the one that is current was the Class A uniform, but that is a service green. It was a uniform created to look more like the dress uniforms back in World War II, and according to Army.mil, were put into service in 2020. So when you look at the weapon systems, the locations, the vehicles, the types of boats and weaponry that show up all over Great War of Separation 1 and 2 and in the Horseman, but most specifically, you look at the uniforms, the Great War of Separation could not have possibly occurred before the year 2020. Now, what does that mean for the rest of the Rippaverse? A lot. Because during the Great War of Separation, Isom, Avery Silman, was a kid. He watched his mother fight the invading US excepts, one of the first times he ever used his powers. Well, Avery's now an adult. If in 2020 Avery was a kid, then what year is a Rippaverse happening now? I think it's well into the future. I think the Rippaverse timeline is actually ahead of the real life timeline. And it kind of makes me think, since GWOT is established, it is canon, the Horsemen fought in the US military in Missoula during the global war on terror, maybe that's why the US lost so much territory. The name Bromhaus does not sound English. It sounds German. Maybe they lost because their forces were all tied up in Iraq and Afghanistan. Maybe. I don't know. But that is what I was able to figure out. If you feel like I missed anything, or if you have some idea of what could contradict this theory, please let me know down below. Most importantly, the big takeaway from this is the absolute impeccable research and consistency in the storytelling of Chuck Dixon, and that in the artwork of Jack Herbert. That is the biggest takeaway, and as I went through this, it was more and more mind-blowing how I could deduce real world years just based on how well he researched the story. That's incredible. So let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you have any contradictions or think I missed something, and I will be checking in on this, as I've already ordered Great War of Separation Part 3, so I am going to be checking in on this theory as we go along. But until then, I appreciate you watching. Bye.